Good morning. I so enjoyed the Lost Shtetl, and I'm thrilled that Max Gross is visiting us, and honored to introduce him to him. Max Gross was born in New York City in 1978. Both his parents are writers, and his home was always filled with books. Max graduated from Dartmouth College and then spent a year in Israel with the Arad Arts Project, an arts fellowship program. He returned home and began work as a journalist, first at the Forward and then at the New York Post before becoming editor in chief of Commercial Observer, a publication focusing on real estate news. Max Gross's first book was a humorous memoir about dating and being mistaken for actor Seth Rogen. The memoir was memorably called From Schlub to Stud: How to Embrace Your Inner Mensch and Conquer the Big City. Since that book's publication, Max happily reports that he's been rescued from that situation, the single man's fate, by his beloved wife and son, with whom he lives in New York. The Lost Shtetl is Max's first novel. Following the publication in October 2020, it won both a National Jewish Book Award and the Top Fiction Prize from the Association of Jewish Literature Libraries. If you have not read The Lost Shtetl or want to give a great gift, our local independent bookstore, Politics and Prose, is offering a 10% discount on The Lost Shtetl to book chat participants. The link is in the chat. And now, Robin and I will ask Max some questions, followed by your questions. So go ahead, Robin.
Okay. All right. I think I pressed the right buttons. So Max, welcome. So nice to meet you, even virtually.
It's lovely to meet you, Robin. And Marge, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thank you for the plug for getting the Lost Shtetl as a gift. That sounds like a great idea. I recommend it.
Yes. We thought you wouldn't argue with that.
I'm not going to argue with that one.
So I thought I would ask you first about your inspiration for the book, because I gather that there are multiple experiences that inspired this novel, and I wondered if you could tell us about them.
Sure. Well, I would say that there was a micro inspiration and a macro inspiration. And I'll start with the macro inspiration, which was, as Marge mentioned, I was a reporter for the Forward for a few years when I, was still in my 20s, a young guy, I had a very odd beat. I used to call it the freak beat, simply because I wasn't on politics, I wasn't on education, I wasn't on charity. I was basically general assignment, and they would put me in wherever I was needed. And I used to get so many odd assignments. And I remember I once got an assignment about New Square, New York, which is upstate New York, which is it's a fully Hasidic town. I think that they're Skver Hasids, and there was a fish that apparently one day woke up and started speaking in Yiddish to the guy who's about to fillet him, and in the fish market there in New Square, New York, and I was sent up to do this, and I didn't have a car at the time. I took the bus up to New Square, and I got off, and this was pre-smartphone, so I was just having to walk around this little town asking people for directions to the fish market, whether they had heard about the fish. And I was treated like, such a strange, like they could tell that I was just like, somebody, a fish so out of water, fish. I walked through this town, and it was like I literally saw a flock of geese pass me across the street in front of me. And I remember thinking, this town is a shtetl. This town could be, just transplanted to Poland, and it would be fine there. And I remember having this thought that a lot of the Hasidic towns that I was, Hasidic neighborhoods that I was writing about, be it in Borough Park or Crown Heights, were very similar in that respect. They were very isolated and hermetic, and it definitely prompted some thoughts about that, and about the desire to separate themselves. A lot of these, Hasidic towns, and as Marge mentioned, I lived in Israel for a year, and you would see that in like Mea Shearim and some of these other neighborhoods in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv, and I thought that was very interesting. How life had persisted and been replanted in the way that it was here in America and elsewhere. And so that was sort of a little bit of my macro thinking about that. And but there was a moment of inspiration, which was I've long been a reader about World War II and the Holocaust, and I remember I was living. This was slightly before I met my wife, so this was a long time ago, more than 10 years ago. I was reading a book by the writer Lucy Davidovic, um, which was called "The War Against the Jews," which was a book about the Holocaust. And this book was very focused on the mechanics of the Holocaust, how it happened, and what all the elements that went into it happening, and what needed to happen, what the Nazis did, almost on like a very micro level. I keep using this micro macro. I apologize. I don't usually talk like that. But on that, like very granular level, like what was happening, how the Holocaust took place, and she talked a lot about just the reach of shtetls and settlements of Jews across Eastern Europe. That there were so many hundreds of towns that were in all of these places, in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Poland. And I just remember having this almost perverse thought: how is it that none of these towns escaped the Holocaust? How is it that none of them didn't have like a bad map written, around them? How is it that not one escaped their attention? And I thought, oh well, if one did, that might be a very interesting story. So that was sort of the inspiration for how I came to the specific story, and a little bit about my background thinking about these kinds of topics.
Thank you. That's so interesting. And some of our commenters in the book discussion part of this program had said that they felt about about no shtetls escaping, but maybe one did, and that's your story, that it made them feel very wistful that, oh, what if one did? Wouldn't that have been great?
Mm.
So let me ask you about the mix of fantasy and reality in your book, which was just great. So on the one hand, the idea of a lost Polish shtetl that misses World War II and modernity is sadly the stuff of fantasy. But on the other hand, your book provided a lot of realistic explanations for how it was that Kreskol got itself lost. And I wondered, what was your thinking about that? Were you trying to make the story as realistic as possible, given the premise? What was your thinking?
Well, I'll tell you, Mel Brooks I once heard Mel Brooks talking about comedy, and he was saying that you had to treat straight topics funny, or funny topics seriously to be funny. Like that, if you and to a certain extent, I thought that a fantastic topic, like something that was the stuff of fantasy, had to be sort of grounded in a kind of realism. It had to be like that I wanted to make it seem as plausible, as possible. And the fact that it was I thought I had there were a lot of writers that I was thinking about in terms of how I was constructing this book. Like there were Yiddish writers like Isaac Bashevis Singer and Shmuel Agnon and Shalom Aleichem. But I was thinking a lot also about some of the magical realist writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I thought that the book I tried to construct Kreskol a lot like he did with Macondo, his town in 100 Years of Solitude, and I always thought that the realist side of magical realism was actually very, very important. Like when you look at a lot of those writers, they do provide backstory for the fantasy, that the fantasy was grounded somewhere in some sort of reality, and I thought that was important. Yes, it is definitely a fantasy, and I think that that's an important part of the book. But I also thought it was also that there had to be an explanation for everything. That there was no leaps into the supernatural, even if it was very unlikely.
Yes, yeah, I that part of it especially appealed to me, that there wasn't really any magic. It was there weren't any dragons, no magical spells. Um, that the magic was maybe in the premise. So let's turn to some of the themes in the Lost Shtetl. Can you talk about some of the themes that interested you and that you wove into the book, especially contemporary themes?
Well, I mean, I think that the book is in many ways about, you know, the attractions of modernity versus the attractions of nostalgia. I think that that was, sort of the big theme that I was dealing with. That I think that there is, and I think that that's a fundamentally, I think it's a universal issue. I think a lot of people, it doesn't certainly doesn't have to be Jews who are interested in grappling with this question, but I think for Jews especially, I think that Jews have, they're, I mean, we're speaking in the diaspora. So, everybody on this call, I assume, unless there's some people calling in from Israel, have, felt the pull of the universalist, of, migrating, of going out and, embracing a different world than, and look, that was not all our choice. In fact, 2,000 years ago wasn't our choice at all. But, it was, but I think that the Jewish people in general have, even back if you look into ancient times, the Hellenists were people who embraced, Greek culture, who embraced, the other, and looked at different cultures with fascination and love. And I think that we've also had, every year we talk about, like, next year in Jerusalem, we talk about this profound love and desire for, our home and for our past. I think that it is, um, as I said, a very human feeling. I think that that there's a push and a pull between modern inclinations and instincts and tradition, and I feel it certainly myself personally, but I think it's a problem that we're grappling with in general in the modern world more than ever. There's been, such a pull towards nostalgia and towards all these other things, um, and there's, a pull towards the future, and those things are in constant conflict, and that's some of the things that I was writing about there. I also just wanted to write about what the Jewish experience was over the last few decades. I think that we were, the benefit of doing a story where you know there's almost this like Brigadoon town is that it almost becomes a time travel piece. You could this town went to bed one day and woke up one day 70 years later. And those last few decades have been so tumultuous and interesting. So it was one of the things that I also wanted to, sort of explore, and tragic, I would say. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I thought that the book couldn't have too happy an ending, because I think that the story of the Jews in Eastern Europe was not a happy one. It didn't end happily, but there have been so many ups and downs over the last few decades. But that's all of Jewish history, I suppose.
Some people have commented on some of the contemporary themes in the book as well. They mentioned fake news, conspiracy theories, Polish Poland becoming more right wing. Was that in your mind as well?
Well, I will admit that I think I sort of lucked out with the location. Several people have asked me, why Poland? And at the beginning, it was mostly because my mother's family were Polish Jews, and so I always regarded myself as like, that was like, where my background was. So I was most interested in Poland. But I think that something interesting has definitely been happening in Poland that made it a lot more relevant. So I got a little lucky in that respect. But yeah, I mean, I think that, and I think this is a little bit about what I was talking about in general. I think that that a lot of the themes that we talk about now of like fake news and all these other things, they're part of that. And I think that a lot of the themes that I wrote about, and because I wrote about the book a while ago, I mean, the book was published almost a year ago, and in the life cycle of these books, they are gestated for a long time before they're published. So some of these themes went into hyperdrive, certainly under a certain president that recently departed Washington, which I won't mention. But I think that he was a part of that nostalgia pull. When he says like "Make America Great Again," I think that that's a pull for nostalgia. I think that it's we won't get into Trump, but that's certainly something that's happening in Poland. The ultranationalist government that's there now and has been clamping down on any kind of criticism of anybody in Poland during the Holocaust, when it's not a black and white story, is very worrying and troubling to me. There's a big rise in anti-Semitism in Poland, which I find extremely worrying and troubling. So yeah, I think that I definitely wanted to hint at a lot of those themes, and I think that. Yeah, I think that to a certain extent I got lucky, but a lot of those themes were out there when I started writing it. I think that there was this pull towards nostalgia for a really long time.
Yeah, and the book, it does permeate the book. You definitely did that so successfully. Let me ask you something more narrow about the narrator. So the book is narrated by an unnamed someone who seems very familiar with Kreskol and its inhabitants. Why did you make that choice to use an unnamed narrator?
Well, I wanted the book to read a little bit like a folktale. I wanted it to be a modern day folktale. So a narrator from 100 years ago reciting events that happened today. And I think that you see a lot of those narrators in, particularly in Isaac Bashevis Singer, who I always think of the book as, you know, in a way, a tribute to him. I would say that there were, three writers that the book is mostly inspired by. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, I mentioned. I think that Yankel's story is very Charles Dickens. I think that there's something very picaresque about, what I was trying to do with his story, and Isaac Bashevis Singer, who I've always regarded as one of the true great masters, and I wanted it to feel like that. in terms of, and it's funny, people have said to me that there was a great deal of disappointment about not naming the narrator. But I actually think that that was something that I would not, I mean, I think writers take criticism in all sorts of different ways, and they rethink things all the time, and they're like, oh, should I have made that mistake? That's one that I would definitely not ever change, because I actually have heard so many interesting theories about who this narrator is. And I think they're better than anything I would have come up with. But, so I like hearing some of the theories about the narrator. But yeah, he or she is somebody in the behind the stalls on market day telling you the way it really went down. And that's who I sort of imagined as who this narrator was.
I like that answer. So I'm going to pause here because Marge has some questions. So let me replace here. So no, but I want you to be back there too. So good. All right.
Okay, so I think you touched on this a little, but your background is in journalism and more recently in real estate journalism. So did you think that that background proved useful in writing the fiction and this book?
It's an interesting question. I would say that being a journalist definitely helped in terms of writing this book, just in the sense that I think that most fiction writers have a choice when they, decide that they want to go into that profession. They can either teach, or they could, I guess they could do all sorts of things to earn money. But I always thought that journalism was a good thing to do, because it sort of forced me to speak to people and to sort of gather people's stories and, be constantly learning, about like the evolution in ways that stories change in ways that you could never have imagined. So for me, it was a very useful thing, I think, to be a journalist. Being at the Forward was, an incredible immersion into Jewish life. I left that a long time ago. It's been a good, 16 or 17 years since I left the Forward, but that it definitely left its footprints. But I think writing about real estate also was an interesting thing to do, because I think I saw the way that a city like New York sort of grew and changed. When you write about, I once, and it's not that I was that interested in real estate when I started writing about it, but I once said to a friend of mine, I'm writing about real estate. It's how exciting is that? And he said to me, that's the great epic saga of New York. That I think I might have actually. Sorry, I think I pressed the alarm on my car. Sorry about that. Accidentally. So my friend said to me, New York real estate is the great epic saga of the city. And I was like, wow, that's sort of true. Like, you look at like the way that New York sort of evolved, and whatever, all the, municipal and city hall fights were about, and the way people live. So I think it was useful. And, there'll be other books that I think will be probably more inspired by real estate that I write beyond the Lost Shtetl, because the way I am now, I'm dealing with so many Meshuggah real estate billionaires, like all day long. I'm speaking to these guys, and it is a shtetl of billionaires to a certain extent. Some of the people who are involved in New York real estate and national real estate, because I talk to some of those people too. But I think that it's almost like you do anything. You focus on the mechanics of anything, it teaches you for other things. And I think that actually helped me in terms of the writing of this, and in terms of other writing as well.
I love your shtetl of billionaires. That's a wonderful. I'd like to read that book.
Maybe that'll be a sequel or something.
Right, right. Here's another question about journalism. In the Lost Shtetl, journalists are eager to report about the discovery of Kreskol and the later discovery of Pesha. Did being a journalist give you a sense of how journalists would react to a big story and influence the way your book played out?
Yeah, I think so. And I actually think that, one of the journalist who finds Pesha and sort of almost, it's funny. I know a lot of journalists like that who are sort of rats, people I don't like, but who are really good at their job and really dogged and in terms of pursuing their job. And I think that it's. I mean, look, I tried to give that as much, the sheen of as much realism as possible as well. But I definitely liked the idea that somebody that I sort of disapproved of as a character was so good at his job and performed it so well.
Okay, that's good. All right. And then I think you touched on this a little too, but maybe you could give us another answer on this one. In one of your interviews, you talked about how the sweep of Jewish history inspires you as a writer. And can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that I mean, I think it's one of the reasons why there are so many Jewish writers in general. I think that when you've got this incredible story, it is something that can't help but inspire you. If you have those inclinations. Um, but just the fact that Jews have sort of touched every corner of the earth, and been involved in all this drama on on so many levels. But the Jewish people in general. I mean, like I don't know anybody who suffered such lows like the Holocaust as the Jews have, and yet so much glory and so much joy as the Jews. I mean, like when we think of like all of the accomplishments of Jews, how many Nobel Prize winning physicists are Jewish. It's it's might be easier to count how many are not Jewish, but they're and how many people have. We have all of these Kafkas and Chagalls and so many people who have done so many wonderful things in the world, who have achieved such success here in America, who've achieved success everywhere, and who are still, to this very day, loathed and despised. It's one of these things that it's a fascinating story. Um, I think that just the American Jewish experience, one of these things that I find, like, I find endlessly fascinating, and certainly the European experience. But you could talk about, like, the Jews in Cochin in India. I mean, the fact that more than 1,000 years ago, that was we had planted those seeds there. And when I say we, I mean Jews, but obviously. I'm a little bit interested because I'm Jewish, but uh, yeah, that I think that was part of the fascination of this story, and I think it gets back to a little bit about what I was saying earlier about this real instinct there is to migrate and to invest oneself in other cultures, and I think that that's something that we've done quite well. The Jews have.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Okay, I'm going to pass this back to Robin now, who's
Well,
going to.
Well, all I'm going to say is, that getting your perspective, Max, makes the experience of reading the book all the richer. So I really appreciate that. And we're going to turn now to audience questions. And I appreciate, your willingness to stay with us longer so that we can give the audience a chance to talk to you. And that even though Marge and I would like to monopolize you, we won't.